about. Now, in 1977, when I first met Bob Monroe, the buildings that we're sitting in didn't exist. This was just farmland, and Bob Monroe lived in a place called Whistlefield, which was an estate about 10 miles from here in rural Virginia. And he had a laboratory there in which he was doing further research into this audio technology, but it was not a widespread thing as it is now. It was just Bob Monroe in his laboratory, and he had a few programs recorded on cassette tapes, and you could sign up to do a weekend workshop, and every now and then Bob Monroe would show up and give a talk somewhere at some seminar. But it wasn't nearly as worldwide and prolific as it is now. So in trying to determine what is the validity, does this stuff really work, and how does it work, talking to Bob Monroe about his background and how this came about, he was a young man, college graduate, looking for a job, and found himself in New York in the radio industry. Eventually rose to the hierarchy and was vice president, I think, of NBC Radio at one time, if I've got the story straight. And at this time, during this period of time, he was part of the social world of New York, the executives of New York, and so forth and so on. And he had what is called a out-of-body experience, a spontaneous out-of-body experience. One night he felt himself bouncing or hitting something hard and flat, and he thought it might be the sheets of his bed or the covers of his bed. And it turned out to be the ceiling itself, because it was rough and textured, and he thought that there was a fountain next to him, and he couldn't figure out why there was a fountain in his bed. Turned out to be the chandelier hanging over the bed. And when he looked down, there was this strange man in bed with his wife, and he couldn't figure out what was going on until he realized that was him down there in the bed. And he was quite panicked about, this is dying, I'm dying now. So he tried very hard, and he pulled himself through the air, swimming through the air, and finally fit himself like a glove back into his body and sat up in bed quite startled and panicked and worried about this whole thing. And after visiting doctors, going to different religious leaders, trying to understand what had happened to him, they talked about an Eastern tradition of going out of body. And if you really, Bob Monroe, if you really want to know more about this, you should go to the Far East and talk to the masters, because they seem to know something about this. Well, he didn't want to do that. He was a businessman in New York, the vice president of NBC Radio. He couldn't do that. But he began to experiment with his own things. Practicing in bed at night, he would feel a sense of vibration, or a sense of becoming puffy, larger, and then reducing to size. And then this vibration would cease at some point, and he found that via what he called a second body, he would reach over and try reaching down through the floor, and then he would reach up through the ceiling, and eventually got brave enough to walk outside and then come back in to make sure he could still come back, and eventually would go to his neighbors and then come back real quick. And after time, he began to venture further and found that this whole local world that we know it is really pretty boring in comparison to all the places in the universe that he could discover in this state. He began to journal and write down his adventures in some journal format. Then it came time that his physical body, he needed to have surgery. He needed to have the carotid arteries cleaned out. He had a plaque build up in the carotid arteries and needed to have surgery to get them cleaned out. And he, at that time when he was having the surgery, late 50s, early 60s, it was a very dangerous operation. Today it's a routine operation, but then it was very, very dangerous. And he gave the manuscript, his work, to one of his closest friends, Charlie Tart, the famous psychologist, to hold for him while he went into surgery in case anything had happened. Well, he came out of surgery and he recovered, and weeks and months rolled by, and got in contact with his friend and said, well, I'd like to get my transcript back. I seem to be healed up now and I'd like to continue my work. And he said, well, Mr. Monroe, this is such a fantastic work. I've given it to a publisher to look at and they'd like to publish a book on this. Well, Bob was torn. Here he was, part of New York society, being very proper and doing all the right things to work his way up through New York society, sort of worried about, well, I don't want this to get out. This is my secret life. This is something else I'm doing. On the other hand, there was like, a book? Somebody wants to publish a book? Well, that'd be kind of nice if somebody published a book. And maybe if they published a book, others would read it and they could help me find out, what's this all about? What's this grand adventure I'm on? Maybe others have had this adventure, and maybe a book would be a good way to do that. And then the other part would come back and say, I don't know, I might lose my job if they found out about this. Well, eventually the book was published, and I remember him telling me one time very vividly about he had been invited to a cocktail party with his boss and so forth and so on, and they were standing around in a high-rise apartment in New York, all with their cocktail glasses, and his boss said, hey Bob, come over here, I want to ask you about that book you wrote. And he thought, oh no, this is the end. NBC's going to fire me, it's going to be all over for me. And his boss said, my wife has this happen to her all the time and she thinks this is just the greatest book she's ever read. I wanted to thank you for that. And so he was like, that was the first time at which he had a sense of relief that this is okay. It's really okay. I'm not going to be ostracized, or I'm not going to be locked up as being crazy, that this is really okay. So it evolved from his New York life, which Lori Monroe remembered very much, working with her daddy, she called him, and these discoveries about hemisync and what it was about. Again, Bob's concept of how is it that this happened to me, and how is it that others might be able to share this. And he began to look at the world around him and some experiences that he had. He was a pilot. And he talks about being in a DC-3 aircraft, a very old and yet very reliable aircraft, which had 2 propellers. And the pilots were trained very carefully to adjust the pitch of the propellers and the RPMs of the engine correctly, else if they were slightly out of tune with one another, the pilots would be exposed to a wow, 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 wow sound as the 2 engines had this beat frequency oscillation. And they had had accidents with the pilots falling asleep. And so they said, you must make sure when you're listening, do not let that sound come through your engines. Adjust the RPMs and the pitch of the props so that that doesn't happen. So he remembered that as a sound concept in its ability to help people to go to sleep. And then he remembers riding on the train from Westchester County into the city to his job, where he would watch people nod off in the morning to sleep and notice that the sound of the train to go across the track seemed to rhythmically cause people to go to sleep. Well, this was a popular time in which sleep learning was an in vogue kind of thing. It was one of those, today if we saw it on television, it'd be 1995, learn while you sleep, 1995. And it's a truly American way to try to get something for nothing. You know, if I don't have to study and work at it, if I could learn while I slept, that'd be a good idea. So there were a lot of products out there on the old 33 RPM records that had your mathematic tables on it and foreign language tables, foreign language lessons on them, different dialogues with promises that all you had to do is play this 33 RPM record and you could learn while you were sleeping. So this went on for quite a while, and Bob also thought, well, this is an interesting concept. And after a few years, scientists began to look at this. Is this true? All of these salesmen are out there marketing these things to the naive public. Is this true? Can you really learn while you're asleep? And the scientists found out that in stages of sleep, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, and REM, that if you are in stage 1, stage 2, this very light stage of sleep, that you could actually test someone the next morning and the multiplication tables were remembered. Their vocabulary skills were improved. But if the person was allowed to go down to stage 3 or stage 4 sleep, it didn't work. So there was a little bit of something to this concept of sleep learning, but only if you could maintain this platform of the early hypnagogic stages of sleep, not down here in the unconscious stages of sleep. So Bob Monroe said, oh, maybe that would be a good thing to do. Maybe we could allow people to get into this balanced stage where, and these are his words, the mind is awake, but the body is asleep. So his first attempts in all of this were in this sleep learning kinds of things. And then it began to develop that, you know, this has something to do maybe with what happened to me. Here I was developing all these sounds, listening very carefully, exposing myself to all these sounds. I wonder if it carried over into that night when I was in the bedroom and I was floating out of my body. And so he began to think that maybe it was the sound experiments he'd done. So he started creating sounds, started creating different sound patterns to experiment with this mind awake, body asleep. And if you talk to his children and his friends, you say, yeah, I remember when Daddy had me learning my times tables. I remember I had to learn my times tables up to 12 because he was experimenting as to whether when I listened to Daddy's sounds, could I learn my times tables? So that grew into people talking about other experiences that they had. And if you think about it for a minute, what if your body was asleep and your mind was awake? What would be going on at those times, which in normal sleep would be unconscious times? What would come to consciousness? And Bob discovered that was the same kind of thing that probably happened to him during the out-of-body experience. Yet the people he began to share this with were having all sorts of very enlightening, life-changing, intuitive insights if they could only remain awake in their mind while their body was asleep. So he began to develop these tape programs and eventually said, you know, if I could just get 5,000 people, that would be a good experiment. 5,000 people to try this out and write down reports about what they experienced, then I'd know. Let's make this a grand experience. We'll call it the M5000 program for Monroe, 5,000 maybe. I don't know if the M really comes from Monroe, but he did call it the M5000 program. Well, it wasn't but a couple of years that we surpassed that 5,000 number. And now we do about 1,000 people a year through the Institute itself, let alone all the home use of this. So in Bob's curiosity, in Bob's investigation to find out what happened to him, created initially this whole idea that has grown decades later into what we have now as the Monroe Institute.